Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Scripture in Black and White. We are thrilled that you have joined us again. I told you on last episode I couldn't wait for this episode because I'm waiting with tiptoe anticipation on the subject that we're going to deal with today. But just to kind of catch us up, we've dealt with some disputable teachings, and we've alluded to those before: the millennium, the rapture, the tribulation. But today, we're going to get into something even more salacious, I should say. So, uh, as we get into it, as you see, me, Anthony Walker, here with my good friend and brother Bobby Harrington. Bobby, it is good to see you.
It's always great to see you.
Yeah,
I enjoy doing
yeah.
these with you.
So today we are going to look at the Antichrist, Revelation chapter 13, and the Antichrist. Bobby, just as kind of a primer for this, why do you believe that this subject matter tends to be, or is trending, I guess, in these days?
I think that we all sense that in North American culture, it can't keep going the way that it is. Like
Mm-hmm.
we see the breakdown of the family, we see debt, we see like sexually salacious, crazy stuff, anxiety and mental health. And, I think the average person realizes it can't keep going. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that we realize something's around the corner.
So
And I
something's
think that
got to happen.
yeah, that leads to an openness, I think, to these teachings that previous times didn't have as much.
Yeah, yeah. So even with, like I said, I think we touched on this on one of the previous episodes as well. I just know that, throughout history there has been a look for this antichrist figure. Like every time an evil dictator or world leader pops up, we're on, how they have tornado warnings, we're on antichrist alert, we're looking for them. And so, in this time, I think people are looking as well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. There's a passage. Let me read it to you. It's from First John chapter 2 verse 18. That it's one of the last parts of the New Testament written, and it the John, who wrote the book of Revelation, most likely wrote First John chapter 2. And in it, he says this. Well, let me tell you what he's going to say first. He's going to say that, this is the last epoch of time. And so the
Okay.
last epoch of time started when Jesus rose from the dead. Okay.
Right.
And he said that you've heard there's an antichrist coming. Let me just read it to you. Dear children, this is the last hour. So that means this is the last epoch. This is the last, time of God's dealings. This is the last hour, and you've heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. So, what John envisions there, he's telling everybody, he said, you've heard that there's an Antichrist coming.
Mm-hmm.
But let me tell you what, even now, he writes, around 90 AD, many antichrists have come. So last episode we talked about Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth, who destroyed the temple, and
Mm-hmm.
and then we had Domitian.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, could have been living when this book was written, the Book of
Mm-hmm.
Revelation. You had the destruction of the temple. That was by people, and then this. I think Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Mao Tse-tung with China. I think they're all antichrist figures. So I think
Mm.
that the idea that you have these antichrist figures in history is really true. But there's going to be a final manifestation, I believe, and I think that's what John is referring to in First John 2:18. So I think there's always been this sense that, man, there are just evil people, and evil can run amok, and that really fits in with what the Bible says.
So, as you point out, Jesus speaking in Matthew 24, that's, around the mid to late 30s. And then you have Paul in the mid to late 50s speaking again. And then you have the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And then here's John at about AD 90. So these kind of 20-year jumps. And between them, history happens, which affects how they are viewing the end times and the warnings, even. By the time Paul is speaking, there's an understanding of what Jesus says in Matthew 24. By the time the temple is destroyed in AD 70, there's an their mind goes back to, man, we heard Paul talk about this 20 years ago. And even now, John, as he is writing in Revelation 13, there is another kind of view of what has taken place in those 20 years. And as you point out, he's even going to say, man, there were some guys, some antichrists that have already come through. So interesting discussion. So, Bobby, help us as we get into this particular episode. Give us some of your expectations for.
Okay, let's do this first. If we
Okay.
can, we're because we're trying to build. We're in this section where we're talking about, the Antichrist figure and false teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So that I envision will be here on planet Earth before Jesus returns. And so if I go back a couple of episodes, Second Thessalonians 2, let me just remind our listeners of what we said then. 10 things. One is Jesus will not return until the lawless one was revealed. He says that in Second Thessalonians 2:3. The man of lawlessness is revealed during a time of rebellion against God or apostasy, where a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, where basically there's a massive turning away from the teachings of Jesus and people going to church. By the way, that's one of the reasons people observing that happening right now throughout North America happened in Europe, a generation earlier. Now it's happening in North America. That's getting people to, lift up their heads and take notice. Even as we said in countries like South Korea, which after World War II, there was a massive conversion of South Koreans to Jesus. But now with Gen Z, it's down to, less than 1% are claiming to be Christians in South Korea. This man, number 3, is doomed to destruction. He sets himself up in God's temple and proclaims himself to be God.
Mm-hmm.
So temple there can be church, and I've suggested that's my best understanding, is that somehow he's setting himself up in the church. Uh, Number 5, he sets himself up over everything that is called God or worshipped. So pretty prideful and self asserting. Number 6, he will personify the power of lawlessness that's already at work in the world. So, lawlessness or evil, he just epitomizes it. Number 7, the lawless one will be revealed when a restraining force is removed. We don't know exactly what that is. Is it government? Is it the church? Is it an angel that's holding him back? Number 8, the lawless one will be destroyed by Jesus when he returns. That is crucial, Anthony, that he's destroyed by Jesus when he returns, because as we look at Revelation 13, I believe that this empire, this beast empire, is also destroyed by Jesus at his return. And if, as I'm going to suggest, you have a false prophet, whom I think is this lawless one, and a beast empire, they're both going to be destroyed when Jesus returns. Number 9, the lawless one will be accompanied, like when he comes, he'll be accompanied by counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders. So he epitomizes false, heretical, terrible teaching. And then 10, God gives or allows a delusion so that people will believe his lies. So that doesn't sound like I'm sure glad Jesus is coming back and he's going to take all the Christians to be with him forever, and it's going to be fantastic, because that sounds really bad what the lawless one is going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that's a very good kind of capsule for us to gather about what we are learning, what we've learned from Second Thessalonians chapter 2. To those who are listening, both Bobby and I are teaching this to our churches, and so we just, I think, approached Second Thessalonians chapter 2 on last week in our class, Bobby, and it's an exciting discussion for people to begin to kind of look at what's happening, and it gives some perspective on what we go through, and even a historical perspective. I think you and I have talked about it before, that historically, whenever there's a calamity or something that comes up, people are kind of, oh, okay, is this what this is? And so having a clear understanding of scripture helps you to better discern, no, that's not what it's talking about. Or, hey, this might, well, could be, it's time to pay attention.
That's right. Now, the last episode where we were in Daniel chapter 7, let
Mm-hmm.
me summarize that, because we looked in Daniel chapter 7 at pretty much we focused on the little horn who is a king, and I think he's going to be epitomized by what we read about in Revelation 13. And I think to some extent he epitomizes the spirit of the Antichrist, although it could be that the idea of an Antichrist would be the false prophet who supports this leader. So in Daniel 7, a horn represents a king, and sometimes a horn represents a kingdom. So often it's a king and a kingdom. Uh, in Daniel 7, the second thing is the king arises after 10 other kings, and he uproots 3 of them. So you have these, and this is going to be important in the book of Revelation. You've got these 10 kings, and then the little horn is an evil king who turns on the 10. Now we saw it could be, if all you had was Daniel 7, that king could have had a role in undermining the other 3, as you suggested. But if they're all simultaneous kings, which we're going to see, I think that Revelation 17 tells us they are, you've got 10 of these kings, and yet there's another one, this um, uh, little horn type figure who turns on the 10. We'll come back to that. Thirdly, this king has eyes like a man. So it's a human, but he's very evil. Number 4, the king will speak against God. He has a mouth that speaks boastfully. Number 5, the king looked imposing. So he's really all powerful, like he's a dictator, dominant, all powerful type. This king wages war against the saints. Uh, this is a king who hates God's people and does things against them. Number 7, he'll try to change the set times and the laws. Now, we don't know what that is. Is it religious laws and ways, or is he going to try to change the calendar? Like, what's that? We don't know. Number 8, the saints will be handed over to the king. He's going to defeat them for a time. So that's 1. Times. By the way, times is 2. It's a reference to 2. So times is 1. Times is 2. And a half a time. So it's 3.5 years. Sometimes it's considered like an incomplete period, or literally 3.5 years. Number 9, the king will defeat the saints. So the little horn is going to be defeating the saints. Notice this: until God pronounces judgment in favor of the saints And at that time, that king's power will be taken away and he's going to be destroyed forever. So we're going to see how Revelation 13 and 17, there's a continuity here. And then number 10, after the king's destruction, the saints will possess the kingdom, and the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to them, and the kingdom they will have, which I suggest is the consummated kingdom of Jesus, will last forever and ever. So that kind of gets us up to where we're at. We're talking about, I would advocate two people: a false prophet, a false leader, and then a king, a leader, a ruler, a dictator who's in cahoots with this lawless one.
Thank you for that. Um, when you think about Daniel and obviously Revelation, they both use or utilize apocalyptic language. And,
Yeah,
in apocalyptic language, and we've alluded to it several times here on Scripture in Black and White, some of the things that you deal with when interpreting that, you have to understand that several types of symbols will be used, numbers, um, um, animals, figurative language, colors, and when you if you looked at it just literally without understanding the language and the meaning for the language, you'll come up with a completely different interpretation. You just touched on one of the kind of hotbed passages, which is in Daniel chapter 7, where he says, a time, times, and half a time. I think I've
yeah,
heard several different understandings of what that phrase means. And
yeah,
so, utilizing those help us just kind of get that, prime us for that, the language, the typology that's even
yeah.
used sometime as well.
So let's talk about it. We talked last week when we were in Daniel 7 about political cartoons, and
Hmm.
a political cartoon will have animals that represent people, and like the donkey represents the Democrat, and the elephant the Republican. Well, going back to ancient Babylon, it was very common where these hybrid animal humans, as it's described, they represented political powers, and that's going to carry on because the Book of Revelation builds on Daniel, the apocalyptic literature of Daniel, of Ezekiel, that's similar, again coming out of Babylon, but also the Book of Revelation builds on the Greco-Roman myths that were common in Asia Minor. Asia Minor is basically a part of Turkey that in the first century was a part of the Roman Empire, and they had like they would read Plato, and they had stories of the goddess Leto, and things like that. That the John is going to use a lot of those imageries, but the dominant imagery is the many of the figures out of the book of Daniel. So let me just mention the ways that people interpret it, and then tell you how I handle it. Um, the first way that people try to interpret it is literal, and when people say, "I just prefer a literal interpretation of the Bible," well, you cannot interpret uh, um, metaphors and symbols that were not to be taken literally. You can't interpret them literally. Like even the book of Revelation tells us that stars are angels. So we can want to make it literal stars, but the book of Revelation tells us no, those are angels. So, we've got to do that. Well, so we're not going to be literal. Then the opposite of that is what often happens, as we've said with, say, Presbyterians or Churches of Christ, or highly scholastic people who have a view of the world where God's like kind of left us and He's going to come back when Jesus returns, and that's it. And these people tend to look at this as just like it evokes feelings. It's broad metaphors and symbols that are not specific. They're just talking about conflict and war and how God wins out in the end, but nothing specific. Well, that's actually not how it was interpreted in the early church. So let me just say that, and it doesn't work real well. Okay, so if I've got those two extremes, literal, and where everything's really specific, and then the others just everything's really general and doesn't mean anything, then in the middle we have a couple of different ways. One is that we have uh, specific uh, descriptions and language that applied to that time only. Well, when you do that with the book of Revelation, you it doesn't apply. We're going to look at things like probably referring to the imperial cult, like the Roman emperors were worshipped in the cities through the sacrifices. I think that's what we're going to see here, and we're going to see that didn't happen in Domitian's time, not like it says. Um, the Roman Empire lasted at least till what 476, so it didn't like collapse the way people who read these images and try to take them a little bit more symbolically of Rome. That doesn't work. So I land more in understanding it through typology. I'm just going to tell you a story really quickly. So
Okay.
I was trying to figure all this stuff out over the years, and when I was in Canada, I was able to take a course at Regent College out of Vancouver with an Old Testament scholar named Bruce Waltke. And I really respected the guy. He was the general editor of the Old Testament translation in the New International Version. So that was a massive
Wow.
project. He had a PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary and then a secondary PhD from Harvard University. And the guy was really a godly man. And so when he taught, I was able to meet him for lunch. And I wanted help to understand Revelation and all these prophecies. And the reason this guy's important is he used to teach at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm not sure if I told you this story, Anthony, and our listeners, or somebody else. So if I've already told this, forgive me. But he was responsible to make sure all the graduates at Dallas Theological Seminary at that time understood what's called dispensational premillennialism. And that it's a view that we're going to talk more about when we talk about the rapture. He would agree, that view would agree with what I'm going to say, mostly on the Revelation 13. But anyway, he would teach there, and he was required to make sure that all the PhD graduates or all the doctoral graduates understood that system and agreed with it, or they couldn't graduate. And then he ran into a problem because he changed his mind on it and he no
Mm.
longer believed it. So then he went and taught at another seminary, Westminster Theological Seminary. But so I asked him if he could recommend the most helpful book. And he recommended a book by a guy named Hans K. Larendel called The Israel of God in Prophecy. And I got that book and I read that book. And the book was really helpful, not for interpreting the book of Revelation, but for describing a method by, by which we understand. And it's typology. So let me explain it because it's really important. A type or a typology looks at an institution, a historical event, a person, or an image that had a, say, first century reference primarily, but it also applied or was a foreshadow or a prefigure of a secondary thing. So it's a prefigure type in its primary and literal meaning. It simply denotes a rough draft, a less accurate model. It's giving us a sense of the thing, but it's actually pointing to something else. So in Scripture, a type is defined as a symbol of something designed by God, but it prefigures a future thing. And what is prefigured is the antitype. So you have the type and the antitype. You say, well, Bobby, that's awfully complicated. I'm sorry about that. Here's what that means. A lot of this stuff is going to be describing things in Revelation 13 that initially look like it's talking about first century things. But if we see it through typology, and I'm going to give reasons why you should do that from the text itself, then it's pointing to something else. Here's what I think it is. I think it is taking first century imagery, like the beast being the Roman Empire. It's a type of Roman Empire, uh, but it's actually casting it on the end times, which is the fulfillment or the thing that the foreshadow points to. Just like the lamb we're going to talk about is not the imperial cult of Rome, but it's pointing to something at the end that has some kind of organic, it's a kind of thing like that, but it's something at the end. So you've got the first century sort of imagery cast on the end times fulfillment. Does that make sense, Anthony?
It does make sense, and I like how you broke that down. So basically, John was using, as you just said, references that could be seen as okay. This stuff is happening right around now, first century stuff, but that actually is the type for what's going to come down the line. Is
You
that
said that better
accurate?
than I did. Way to go.
Okay. All right. All right. I got it. I got it. So, and again, thank you for also breaking down just the concept of what to look for when you're reading Daniel, when you're reading Revelation 13. Some of the things we haven't gotten exhaustive in the book of Revelation, but definitely just kind of peeled off a couple of layers of this apocalyptic language. And I also enjoyed how you looked at kind of both sides because there's and I shouldn't say both sides. There are multiple sides that people have on this, but there's the one side to where, like you said, all of it is literal. We're looking for the literal thing. The problem that you run into is that even the author is using language that we know real time was not literal. So if you
Yes.
took something literal that was not meant to be literal, your interpretation is going to be off. But then if you go to the opposite side to say, oh, it's all metaphorical completely, like it's just, oh, it's really dealing with this. No, because he's actually describing something that will happen, but using metaphorical language. So, you have to be able to parse both of those in your biblical interpretation.
That's right.
All right, so Revelation 13, um, you know, uh, for those that I'm sure Bobby and I were on a show at the same time for a brief time, Fearless with Jason Whitlock. And I'll never forget this because Revelation 13 comes up in my mind for this reason. Jason had kind of previewed what the episode was going to be about. And unfortunately, that week, Bobby had a conference to go to. This particular week, Jason asked a simple question about Revelation 13. And I tell you, I was sweating because it's such a deep concept. I mean, we've spoken thus far, for hours, and there's a free ebook, etc., on some of this end time stuff. But I was going to have like 7 or 8 minutes in a segment to deal with this. So now it's Bobby's turn. You got longer than 7 or 8 minutes to help us with Revelation 13 because it's going to deal with some things that I'm sure people are interested about in this time space. So
All
help
right.
us out, Bobby.
Okay, let me start by reading Revelation 13, verse 1. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea. Now, we know from reading the book of Revelation that the dragon is Satan. So, what John is telling us is that Satan, representing the dragon, is going to inspire what's going to happen next. Then he says this, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and each head had a blasphemous name. Now, if you're just reading this for the first time, you'll go, what? But again, if we go back to Daniel chapter 7 and we look at the imagery, think of a political cartoon, and he's just described a political cartoon. If you're joining us on YouTube, we have a couple of pictures here that artists have created of this like beast that has, you know, 7 heads and 10 crowns. And, just it's awe-inspiring in a negative way. Like, this is an awful beast, and the beast is a political empire. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like a lion. The dragon, so Satan, gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. So this is a political power described in an awful way in this beast language, like a terrible political cartoon, uh, and Satan's behind it. Then he
Bobby,
says
do
this.
you think that the readers and those who would have heard this at the time, who have read this at the time, do you believe their mind would have been triggered by some of these things that John is bringing up? Like, you know, he brings up the leopard, lion. He brings up this beast with 10 crowns. Do you think their mind would go, wait a minute, I've heard something like that before?
Yeah. Well, we know this, that the early churches really grew out of the synagogue. And so that people coming out of the synagogue would have had a good memory of Daniel, the book of Daniel, especially Daniel 7. And then it was just more common in the ancient world that they used this kind of language. We have
Okay,
the book of Enoch, which was also well known to Jewish people, that has imagery somewhat like this. And so it was more of a common thing.
gotcha.
Now, let me read the next verse, verse 3, and I'm gonna tell you how I understand these verses without doing a lot of back and forth on telling you all the different views, because
Okay,
that just is going to get confusing. I'm just going to cut to the chase of what I think. Okay, so verse 3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a wound, but the fatal wound had been healed, and the whole world was filled with wonder uh, and followed the beast. So here's a beast that seems like it's died and now it's come back to life. It's had a fatal wound, but then it lives and it's healed. So I'm just tipping you off. I think that the primary reference a lot of people would taken was the Roman Empire, and we know that the Roman Empire died. Uh, Depending on which date you want to pick, but let's pick 476. I think this is describing some kind of Roman Empire type thing that comes back to life. People worship the dragon, so they're going to worship Satan because he had given authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? So this is a powerful military, political empire. And I believe it's describing something that has not yet come about in our lifetime. Then notice verse 5. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise authority for 42 months. That's 3.5 years. Okay? Now, we saw that in Daniel chapter 7. That's what the little horn, the powerful leader, did. He was boastful and blasphemous. Verse 6, it opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. Whoa. So this is literally Antichrist, blasphemy, blasphemy of God, blasphemy of heaven and those who are in heaven. I mean, it's the epitome of uh, prideful, arrogant, evil assertions of power, and existence. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. So the beast empire is going to go to war against Christians. And it was given authority, notice this, Anthony, over every tribe, people, language, and nation. I think one of
Mm.
that is true of the beast empire here is it's worldwide. I don't think it's like just in Europe or just in, say, Iran or something. The best way to understand that, now I know in the first century they talked about Rome being like the whole world, but even the writers then knew about India and about China. Okay, I think this is using the type of Rome, which was the dominant world power, but it's saying it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation, which is very similar to Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, which talks about in the new heaven and new earth, there will be people from every nation, language, tribe, and people, which we take to mean we got to get the gospel to every people group on planet earth. I think this is saying it is a international power that's in control.
Wow. Wow. That I'm gonna let that marinate.
Okay. If you've heard of Davos, you can see why Christians who understand Revelation 13 the way I do pay attention to when they're saying the World Forum at Davos, where they talk about one world, United Nations power or something.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
it just the hairs on the back of my neck stand up with that. Okay,
Mm.
verse 8. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. So, other than Christians, everybody's going to buy into this political beast empire. Then he says, whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Anthony, I just want to point out that's so similar again to Daniel chapter 7, that there's this persecution, waging war, and being effective against God's people. So, what we're encouraged to look at here is when this happens, we shouldn't think we can overthrow it or it's going to be overcome. Not in this world. And so, into captivity we will go. All right, let's pause there because now we're going to shift and talk about what I believe to be the false prophet.
All right. So in this piece, you're mentioning how you believe that this is kind of what leads to this one world order.
Yeah, I think that what you've got is you got a political empire,
Hmm.
and then you've got a religious system that backs it up. Now, to remind everybody, in the first century, the Roman Empire was supported by the imperial cult. So they had sacrifices in every major city, and oftentimes you literally had the Roman imperial cult. Now, in other places, the other gods that people made sacrifices to, they did it on behalf of the imperial cult. For example, Jews made an agreement with Rome that they would be able to worship Yahweh as long as they offered prayers and sacrifices on behalf of Rome, like asking God to bless Rome, which the Jews agreed to do. Okay, but the others, they literally did it to support Rome.
Mm, gotcha. Gotcha. Well, let's keep it rolling, Bobby.
Okay, verse 11. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. So the idea of a lamb, you've got lambs for sacrifice, but you've also got lambs being mild and not threatening. But he says, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. So whatever it's doing on behalf of the beast empire, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. Now, this thing of a wound that has been healed, or of an empire, or the beast empire was, then it was not, yet it will become again. I just want to ask our listeners to investigate that and see if that supports what I'm saying about some version of a revived empire that's a lot like the Roman Empire. Verse 13, and it performed great signs. Okay. So if this is the lawless one of Second Thessalonians 2, there's a perfect match. It performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Remember, the lawless one did all kinds of false signs, miracles, and wonders. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So it's gonna have people set up an image, sort of worship at some image of the beast. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. I have no idea what that is, but it just does seem to be describing some false image that has this ability to do things that like astound people. Verse 16, it also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, slave, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand and on their foreheads, so they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. All right, so what's going on here? This false religion advocates for you can't buy or sell stuff unless you have a mark. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's take first century imagery. They have a mark, right, on their hand or their forehead. Well, what if that's a type of an antitype? What would that be? Some version of, you can't buy or sell or trade without this number, without this mark. And Anthony, I don't know if you follow this, but a lot of people are talking about in the future when cash isn't being used anymore, which we're not that far from it. And you've got like in China and places like that, the only way that they buy things is electronically.
Mm-hmm.
And, let's let the text speak for itself. So it's some kind of false religious thing with false signs, miracles, and wonders. And they get people, they can't buy or sell or trade unless they got a mark.
This
Well,
was one of the areas though where at the time, because this would have been maybe 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, where the thought of a lot of people was that was the vaccine, because at the time, the
yeah,
vaccine, you could not work, you could not do certain things unless you had the vaccine. And so people were kind of, oh, is this what Revelation 13 is talking about?
yeah. You have an electronic passport like in Europe now. They just
Hmm.
put it under your skin and, you know, it just identifies you. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, that's why you can't help but read this text and ask those questions about stuff like that.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
I think whatever it's going to be, I don't know that we see it yet, but you sure have to ask questions when you hear these things and you read the text. Then it says this, and I want to come back to this. It says in verse 18, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is a number of man. That number is 666. I want to come back to this called gematria, and I want to come back and we can, at the end of our time, come back and talk about what that might be. Before I do that, though, I'd like to look at Revelation 17 because it comes back there and talks about this beast. But let me pause, Anthony, in case you have any questions or clarifications or input.
Oh no, no. You mentioned you were going to come back to that number, so we'll keep it rolling.
Okay. So, again, for our audience, I want to take you to Revelation 17 because John repeats in Revelation 17 and then again in Revelation 19 more about the beast. And so he's going to give some clarification. And I think this ties in with Daniel 7. So I just want to highlight it. He says this in Revelation 17:3. He says, "The angel carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness." So he's talking about his vision, and angels carrying him. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, that's the beast we saw in Revelation 13. Same
Mm,
beast, right? 7 heads, 10 horns, so 10 rulers. Okay, now the woman is a city that's kind of like a prostitute that is sort of at the center of this beast empire. We could come back to that at another time. Right now, I just want to stick with the beast empire. Verse 8, the beast which you saw, notice this language, once was, now is not, yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. So you have this kind of revival of this beast empire. Again, that's why I think Rome is the type for the antitype. This thing's going to be a lot like Rome in terms of its dominant power. Then it says this, the inhabitants of the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. Okay, so this beast empire, this revived beast empire, is a big deal. Notice verse 12, back to our conversation about the 12 horns of the 12 kingdoms in Daniel 7. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. So, depending on how you date the book of Revelation, some people have it as early as Nero, like in the early 60s. Probably not. Most people look at it during the reign of Domitian, somewhere around 90 AD. Okay? Here's what he says in 90 AD then. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings that have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. So you got these 10 kings, and then another one, like the little horn. Notice what it says. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. So the 10 kings give their power and authority to the beast. Maybe it goes along with the little horn defeating 3 of the kings, and then the other 7 just join in. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he's the Lord of lords and King of kings. With him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So again, this beast empire is going to persecute Christians. But I think here, Anthony, he's explicitly connecting with the 7 kings of Daniel 7.
mm. So, okay. Um, what are some? Give us one because I know we're kind of trying to keep this on a time basis, but what is a pushback that some give against that particular view as far as 17, that this is something different?
Um, what is the critique of my position that people make? That's what you're asking. Um, so usually they don't get this far where we get this conversation.
Okay.
Um, they don't want to correlate. Here's what it would be: they don't want to correlate the 7 kings to Daniel 7. Um, I just think that if Daniel 7 is talking about Rome, we know that Revelation 13 and 17 are using Rome as the whatever it is for the type and the foreshadow. So I don't know how they get away. I don't know how you would get away from it, and that's one of the reasons why I'm because I haven't thought of a way that it wouldn't be true. So
Gotcha.
I'll
Gotcha.
plead ignorance. Let me go to Revelation 19 because he's already talked about it in Revelation 17:14, talking about how Jesus is going to defeat uh, the beast empire. Like the lamb is going to destroy him.
Mm-hmm.
Revelation 19 talks about it in more detail. He says, Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the ruler on the horse and his army, which is Jesus with the angels of heaven. But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed signs on its behalf. By the way, that's just one of those clarifying verses in 19 and 20. The beast and the false prophet, right? And that the false prophet had performed the signs and miracles on behalf of the beast empire. They were captured. With these signs, he had deluded those who received the mark of the beast and worshiped its image. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. So I think he's talking about the destruction when Jesus comes back in Second Thessalonians 2, same thing. He'll destroy him by the breath of his mouth when he comes back. And I think it's talking about the same thing. Does that at least make sense? I'm not saying do you agree with me. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, yeah, it makes sense. The one thing I was going to ask about that part was, for those that may have a different view, isn't isn't when Jesus returns, doesn't he destroy everything? Like all, there isn't anything that would stand after he returns. I mean, time, history is done. Any kingdom, any
Yeah,
establishment,
I think
any
that that's right. But what we have is like on planet Earth,
right,
uh, when he comes back, there's this defeat before the final judgment. There's this defeat of the false prophet and the
right,
beast empire and this triumphal victory described in Revelation 19 and I think Matthew 24 and in Second Thessalonians chapter 2. There's this he's
okay,
coming back and he destroys his enemies.
okay, okay. All right,
It's good.
all right.
All right, let's go back. I know our time is uh, getting close to being done. Let's go back to Revelation 13:18 and the number 666. Okay. Again, let me read it again. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is a It is the number of a man, or that could be translated humanity.
Mm-hmm.
That number is 666. So
Mm-hmm.
it's gematria. So what it is there is if you were to take like, let's just take English, the alphabet, and you make A is one, B is two, C is three, and then you have the numbers. When you know the numbers, it gives you the letters, right? So
Okay.
gematria with Greek, and I've got a thing here you can put on the screen for people to see it. You know, one is alpha, two is beta, three is gamma, four is delta, and so forth. So people have said, all right, that's what it is. What's 666? So, um, by the way, Adolf Deisman, in his book Light from the Ancient East, has a I think it was an inscription on stone or something. I love her whose number is 545. Well, who's that? We don't know. So let me just say the simplest thing that people try to say is that if seven is perfect for godly biblical people,
Mm-hmm.
666 would be the opposite of that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
try to say that. Other people try to use a misspelling of Nero. Like you can't have a direct spelling of Nero and get to 666. You can do it with a variant reading on Caesar in Hebrew, but that doesn't work. Um, and basically, people have tried to come up with an answer for it, but nobody's been able to come up with a good answer. So let me just say it's gematria. Uh, you got the chart there that you can look at where you take the Greek alphabet and you have one letter for each one. Uh, but I don't know that anybody knows what that is yet. So maybe
You
something
know,
will
the
come up
one,
and Christians will go, now that makes sense. That's what it is. That's that little horn, that Antichrist figure, that beast, that political dictator who's evil. I don't know.
yeah, the one that I was most intrigued by or interpretation of that is, and you almost hit head on with it, is three is the number of Trinity,
Yeah.
and seven is the number of completion, perfection, and so 777 would be that perfect God descriptor, right? Seven
Yeah.
being perfection, and then three being Trinity. That would be God. But then, as you point out, six is just shy of God. It is, you failed to get there. So a trinity of not making it there would be a failure to be God. So this beast is a failure to be God, is about as close that I can come up with, Bobby.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know. So, I'm content with not knowing. And, I think a lot of this stuff, here's how I look at it just for our listeners. In the first century, there were prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and they had different ideas about the Messiah. You know, so they would take those passages, and when you read through the Gospels, they clearly were anticipating the Messiah, but they misunderstood and didn't get it that he wasn't going to come just once. He was going to come to die for our sins, and then there would be an intervening period, and he would come back and destroy the enemies. They just thought he was coming to destroy the enemies. So, but they missed it. And
Mm.
I'm content to believe that um, it's going to be difficult, and a lot of us will miss it. But I'm also going to be content to think that when it happens and we see it, then we'll say that's it. Just kind of like they did with about the like the Ethiopian eunuch realizing that the Old Testament in Isaiah 53 prophesied that the Messiah would die for our sins. And
Yeah.
like that came together then for him, but people didn't anticipate that. So I'm content with things like this making sense at the time. And most people won't, and I still think that's part of the whole eminence is that most people will not be tuned into this stuff. Even
Mm-hmm.
today, amongst Christians, most Christian scholars and most Christians, they're not going to believe what we're saying about Revelation 13, and so they dismiss it. So most won't. If we're right, if I'm right, most even Christians won't really understand what's happening. But I think there's enough that do, and this understanding, I just commend it to our listeners. You'll have to figure it out for yourself. I don't have all the answers, but this is my best understanding and my best explanation.
For those that have the interpretation or are pleased with the interpretation of, in the end God wins, to them you say what, Bobby?
Well, I say that you have to back up and tell you
Okay.
why I believe this is in there. First of all, the
Okay.
whole counsel of God, it's all
Sure.
inspired.
Yes.
Secondly, he wants us to understand the whole counsel of God, or at least to do our best to follow it. That's why it's in the Bible. I personally believe that this warns us to be leery about the future, to be ready for bad things to happen, to be
Mm.
prepared so that we don't get wiped out, because it says the love of most will grow cold and many will fall away. It's a great apostasy. If I'm expecting there's going to be a great apostasy, if I'm expecting that sometime, God's people are going to experience tremendous persecution by an evil empire, then I'm going to be watching for it, and I'm going to be preparing to be faithful, and I'm going to encourage my children, my grandchildren, and my church and our churches to be that faithful remnant,
Yeah.
to be ready, whether it's now or 50 years from now. Let's be faithful. Let's be not buying into the concept that everything is just going to be great. And let's be tough minded about it. So, what I say to the pan millennialists is you're not preparing people for difficulties that I see the text teaching.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
In fact, let me close with, for my part, I want to close with this. One of the things, Anthony, that I believe is really right minded when we seek to understand the New Testament is we want to ask, how did others understand it? Now, some of my friends, they go back to the Protestant reformers in the 1500s, and what did they think? I don't think the Protestant reformers are as helpful as the early church fathers and the early Christian writings. So I don't. I want to listen to the second and third centuries about the first century documents more than 15 centuries, because 1500 years after the fact is not as helpful as 100 or 200 years. Other people have the same culture who were discipled by the apostles and all of that. So let me give you an example, and I want to quote from the Didache for you. So the Didache is in the second century, the early part of the second century. If the book of Revelation was written in 90 AD, most people think the Didache is probably from about 125 AD. So we're talking 35 years. And here's how they understood. And I just commend this because the Didache in the ancient church and throughout history has been very respected as giving us a window to what the earliest Christians thought and expected. In the Didache in chapter 16, here's what it says: For in the last days false prophets and corrupters shall be multiplied, and the sheep shall be turned into wolves, and love shall be turned into hate. For when lawlessness increases, they shall hate and persecute and betray one another. Then shall appear the world deceiver as Son of God, and shall do signs and wonders, and the earth shall be delivered into his hands. And he shall do iniquitous things which have never yet come to pass since the beginning. Then shall the creation of men come into the fire of trial, and many shall be made to stumble and shall perish. But those who endure in their faith shall be saved from under the curse itself. Then he says this: Then shall appear the sign of the truth. First, the sign of the outspreading of in heaven, then the sign of the sound of the trumpet, and third, the resurrection of the dead. Yet not all, but as it said, the Lord shall come, and with his and all his saints with him. Then shall the world see the Lord coming upon the clouds of heaven. Anthony, I think that from the Didache, it fits right in with everything we've been saying. And it is the earliest testimony of what the earliest Christians after the New Testament believed about what the New Testament taught.
Mm. That is an interesting point, Bobby. As you point out, and we even touched on this earlier, with the passage of time, sometimes that impacts how the text had been interpreted as it relates to end times. The 20
Yeah.
years or so later, 20 years or so later, and so here's another 30 years later, versus, as you point out, scholars that come 1,500 years later
Yeah.
that look at it. Interesting, interesting. Listen, you all, we thank you for sticking with us on this episode. And Bobby, you've done just an excellent job at breaking down several different concepts and several different elements of this chapter in Revelation 13 regarding the Antichrist, the beast, the false prophet. Great job. And for those that are joining us again, we always encourage you, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our page because we've got podcasts like this one and others that are here as well. Always check out renew.org for all kinds of biblical content and teachings. And also pertaining to this particular podcast, we have a free ebook that deals with end times as well. Simply go to renew.org/end times. Again, from myself and Bobby, we thank you all for joining us on Scripture in Black and White.
Thank you.